This section is about action words. This is the sign for bite. Now practice the sign for bite. This is the sign for blow. Now practice the sign for blow. This is the sign for break. Now practice the sign for break. This is the sign for bring. Now practice the sign for bring. This is the sign for build. Now practice the sign for build. This is the sign for buy. Now practice the sign for buy. This is the sign for can. Now practice the sign for can. This is the sign for carry. Now practice the sign for carry. This is the sign for catch. Now practice the sign for catch. This is the sign for chase. Now practice the sign for chase. This is the sign for clean. Now practice the sign for clean. This is the sign for close. Now practice the sign for close. This is the sign for cook. Now practice the sign for cook. This is the sign for cry. Now practice the sign for cry. This is the sign for dance. Now practice the sign for dance. This is the sign for draw. Now practice the sign for draw. This is the sign for drink. Now practice the sign for drink. This is the sign for drive. Now practice the sign for drive. This is the sign for drop. Now practice the sign for drop. This is the sign for dry. Now practice the sign for dry. This is the sign for dump. Now practice the sign for dump. This is the sign for eat. Now practice the sign for eat. This is the sign for fall. Now practice the sign for fall. This is the sign for feed. Now practice the sign for feed. This is the sign for find. Now practice the sign for find. This is the sign for finish. Now practice the sign for finish. This is the sign for fit. Now practice the sign for fit. This is the sign for fix. Now practice the sign for fix. This is the sign for get. Now practice the sign for get. This is the sign for give. Now practice the sign for give. This is the sign for go. Now practice the sign for go. This is the sign for hate. Now practice the sign for hate. This is the sign for have. Now practice the sign for have. This is the sign for hear. Now practice the sign for hear. This is the sign for help. Now practice the sign for help. This is the sign for hide. Now practice the sign for hide. This is the sign for hit. Now practice the sign for hit. This is the sign for hold. Now practice the sign for hold. This is the sign for hug. Now practice the sign for hug. This is the sign for hurry. Now practice the sign for hurry. This is the sign for jump. Now practice the sign for jump. This is the sign for kick. Now practice the sign for kick. This is the sign for kiss. Now practice the sign for kiss. This is the sign for knock. Now practice the sign for knock. This is the sign for like. Now practice the sign for like. This is the sign for like, as in similar. Now practice the sign for like, as in similar. This is the sign for listen. Now practice the sign for listen. This is the sign for love. Now practice the sign for love. This is the sign for make. Now practice the sign for make. This is the sign for need. Now practice the sign for need. This is the sign for open. Now practice the sign for open. This is the sign for paint. Now practice the sign for paint. This is the sign for play. Now practice the sign for play. This is the sign for pour. Now practice the sign for pour. This is the sign for pretend. Now practice the sign for pretend. This is the sign for pull. Now practice the sign for pull. This is the sign for push. Now practice the sign for push. This is the sign for put. Now practice the sign for put. This is the sign for read. Now practice the sign for read. This is the sign for ride. Now practice the sign for ride. This is the sign for rip. Now practice the sign for rip. This is the sign for run. Now practice the sign for run. This is the sign for say. Now practice the sign for say. This is the sign for see. Now practice the sign for see. This is the sign for share. Now practice the sign for share. This is the sign for show. Now practice the sign for show. This is the sign for sing. Now practice the sign for sing. This is the sign for sit. Now practice the sign for sit. This is the sign for skate. Now practice the sign for skate. This is the sign for sleep. Now practice the sign for sleep. This is the sign for smile. Now practice the sign for smile. This is the sign for spill. Now practice the sign for spill. This is the sign for stand. Now practice the sign for stand. This is the sign for stay. Now practice the sign for stay. This is the sign for stop. Now practice the sign for stop. This is the sign for sweep. Now practice the sign for sweep. This is the sign for swim. Now practice the sign for swim. This is the sign for talk. Now practice the sign for talk. This is the sign for taste. Now practice the sign for taste. This is the sign for think. Now practice the sign for think. This is the sign for throw. Now practice the sign for throw. This is the sign for touch. Now practice the sign for touch. This is the sign for try. Now practice the sign for try. This is the sign for wait. Now practice the sign for wait. This is the sign for wake. Now practice the sign for wake. This is the sign for walk. Now practice the sign for walk. This is the sign for want. Now practice the sign for want. This is the sign for wash. Now practice the sign for wash. This is the sign for will. Now practice the sign for will. This is the sign for wish. Now practice the sign for wish. This is the sign for work. Now practice the sign for work. This is the sign for look. Now practice the sign for look.